Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 11th and final academic series of the year, hosted by Campaign Lab. Today we have Katharina Lawall from LSE, if I'm not mistaken. She'll be talking about how to sustain inclusive politics and retaining women in politics. Um, Before I sort of do the introductions, just a little bit of housekeeping, a quick reminder. This event is recorded, and you'll likely be able to access a recording of this on our YouTube channel later on, or provided we get all the permissions. The next event that we'll be having in January, on January 29th of January, will be done by James Ackland, who will be talking about neighborhood effects on voter choice. Hope to see many of you there as well. Brief introduction to Katharina. She is a quantitative social scientist, passionate about using evidence-based insights for social good. She was a postdoctoral fellow in political science at the Center for Politics of Feelings and completed her PhD in political science at the London School of Economics in 2022. She works in comparative political behavior using quantitative methods, including online and field experiments. In particular, Katharina researches effective polarization, political behavior, campaigns, and gender. Her research has been published in the American Political Science Review and forthcoming at the Journal of Politics. Welcome, Katharina. We are looking forward to your presentation. Fantastic,
Thanks so
interesting
much.
subject.
Thanks so much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah. Whenever you're ready, please feel free to begin.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really nice to share my research. I'm an academic. I work at a university. I'm currently a lecturer in comparative politics at the University of Reading, but I really like working across different sectors. Some of my work is very practical, very applied. I work a lot with civil society organizations, both in the UK and in other countries, including the US and Germany. So it's really lovely to be here and share some of this with you and get your thoughts on this as well. A lot of the work that I'm going to present is collaborative, so I just want to introduce my co-authors to you. They're Omar Hamoud Gallego, who's at the University of Durham, Miguel Pereira, who's at LSE, and Denise Barron, who's still associated with the LSE as well. So today what I'm going to talk about is how to sustain inclusive politics, and particularly retaining women politicians. Some of my other work is more on polarization and the radical right. So I'm hoping that this is the sort of more positive, practical kind of flip side work to this on how underrepresented groups and minoritized groups can actually succeed when the political climate becomes more divisive, more polarized, more emotive, in potentially challenging ways. Cool. So we know that women remain underrepresented at all levels of government, in most Western democracies, and that this underrepresentation of women in elected office has negative, both symbolic and substantive policy consequences. And with that, I mean, if institutions aren't representative of the population that they represent, often the policies that are enacted fail to sort of accurately capture everyone's policy preferences. And we also know that if more women are in office, that changes the types of welfare and education policy, for instance, that are passed by institutions. Symbolic consequences are about how represented citizens feel by the democratic institutions that they have access to. And we know, for instance, that if there are girls growing up in kind of institutions or in a country where very few women are actually represented in those institutions, this can have a negative kind of knock-on effect on how likely those girls are to sort of think about themselves as potentially being able to go into politics later on. So this underrepresentation can have really negative further consequences for both the policies but also the sort of symbolic consequences and underrepresentation spirals that they lead to. And so obtaining better, sort of representative, diverse institutions is a really core aim in lots of Western democracies at the moment, and something that democracies that care about good sort of substantive representation should care about. And so when we think about women in politics, especially, there's actually quite a lot of work on the early stages of candidacy. If you work in a campaign, for instance, or a political party, or if you're an activist, and maybe your organization has worked a lot to sort of try and think about how we can get women through the door in the first place, right? So lots of academic research on this showed initially that women are less likely to think about themselves as wanting to run for office, that they on average express lower political ambition, and are less likely to be recruited by political parties and campaigns. And so naturally, a lot of the solutions, both from within academia, but also the civil society and the campaign space, have focused on trying to remove barriers to candidate entry and encouraging women to run in the first place. For instance, through candidate training programs, through encouraging local party branches to more single out women and actively recruit them into these candidacy positions. And this has had a lot of positive impact. There's lots of sort of research showing that this work is important and effective. And it's great to see there's been lots of strides made on this, both from the sort of political party and civil society space, but also from what we know about this in terms of academic research. But one thing, like one shift that I want to kind of introduce today as something I think that we're missing is that this sort of pipeline is leaky throughout. All right. So if we think about why women remain underrepresented at many levels of government, we don't just need to look at candidate entry. We need to look at what happens to women throughout this pipeline. So what I'm trying to say here is that even once women are elected, they're finally through the door, they're in these positions, they are also disproportionately likely to drop out of office again. And that is really costly if you think about the amount of effort, right, that sometimes campaigns or organizations have invested in training women up and trying to get them into these institutions. But it's also really problematic if we think that it takes time for underrepresented groups to build up political clout, expertise, competence to actually affect these policy solutions that then lead to these sort of positive benefits of representation. And so while a lot of work has been done on candidate entry, I would say there's a lot less that we know about retention or endurance. So what happens at later stages of this pipeline? And just to kind of drive home the point that this is a problem, this is data from an original survey that one of my co-authors, Miguel Pereira, conducted among local elected politicians in different countries. And what we can see here is quite clearly a pattern where men in green are more likely to say that they would stand for re-election than women in blue, right? These gaps kind of vary in size, particularly bad in Italy, for instance, but they exist sort of across the board. And importantly, they also exist in the UK. They also exist in the data I'm going to show you. Of course, this is survey data, but even if you look at validated sort of records of which candidates stand again, after what time, after how many terms do people drop out, we see quite clearly that women are more likely to drop out than men. And there's something important going on here if we think that it's important not just to kind of get women through the door, but also to retain them throughout, to arrive at a sort of sustainable long-term representation. And so the big question that sort of motivates this overall research agenda is what can encourage women and other underrepresented groups to actually stay in politics, not to kind of get them through the door necessarily, but to stay once they're there. And here we look at what we would call two types of political ambition, bit of a weird word in political science. What I just mean by that is static ambition is sort of staying in the office that you're at the moment. So if you're a local elected politician, that would be standing for re-election and wanting to stay in that office, going for another term. And progressive ambition, which is seeking higher office. And by higher office, I would mean if you're a local elected politician, that would be trying to stand as MP, for instance, trying to stand as a mayor in the area that you're in. So trying to sort of think about kind of one level up, what's the higher office you could kind of go for. And just to preview really briefly, the type of intervention we're going to look at in this research is if providing women counselors with access to a real network of peer support, so other women counselors who might be going through similar challenges, reduces these gender gaps in political ambition. And just to preview briefly, we find that yes, these are effective. So really important kind of first evidence that some things that potentially political parties and importantly civil society are already sort of starting to do are really important in making these groups feel supported and able to cope with some of the challenges that they're experiencing once they're elected. So why do we think that this additional support is kind of necessary in the first place? Well, we know that women politicians face higher costs of being in office than their male counterparts. They're more likely to experience discrimination and harassment, both online and in physical spaces. They're also more likely, on average, to burden childcare and caring responsibilities in general than their male counterparts. And so the sort of trade-offs of staying in office versus other responsibilities that are competing with that time, those resources, are more burdensome for women politicians on average. There's lots of other structural factors that shape the experiences of women politicians. But the important, I think, thing here is that while structural reforms to address these root causes are really important, so thinking about better reporting procedures, for instance, for harassment, or thinking about childcare provision, while that is going on, we still need to do something to try and support these individuals and sort of inform them about coping mechanisms in the meantime, right? And so, in those really challenging circumstances, other research has found that support from the political party and grassroots networks can help reduce these costs, basically, that women face disproportionately to men who are in politics. And really importantly, that being able to exchange about these challenges and maybe learn new information about coping mechanisms, reporting mechanisms, access to extra support through peers is a really important way to promote resilience in marginalized communities. And so, in short, having access to these support networks matters because they can help women candidates and politicians feel that it's easier to be able to bear the significant costs of campaigning and indeed being a politician in general. The other important thing to notice here is that access to these support networks, of course, isn't evenly distributed. Women, on average, say that they know less sort of these networks. And we know from a lot of research done in the US, for instance, in legislative institutions, that these kind of old boys clubs that men maybe tap into sort of more easily don't exist to the same extent as they do for women. Don't exist to the same extent for women politicians. And so that leads us to think that providing this access, this knowledge that there is this peer support network out there, there is this sort of safe, supportive community for you to be honest about your challenges, ask those questions, get that information on coping mechanisms, would increase women's willingness to stay in office, even though the sort of circumstances around that office are not ideal. So, access to peer support networks should increase women's political ambition. That's the kind of main idea we're testing in this work. We're testing this in the context of local politics in the UK, specifically in England. And You might think local politics sounds kind of cozy and community oriented and not that hostile, but I think we all remember this meme about Jackie Weaver, where, quite clearly sort of showed, although in an anecdotal way, that local politics can often be quite a lot more hostile, specifically towards women authority figures, than we might have assumed. And indeed, local politics in England especially actually shows quite large gender gaps. Just 36% of the around 20k councillors are women in 2022. Um, and this gets even worse when we look at sort of seniority within council. So who's the leader of a council, who is sort of sitting on the front bench, who holds important, powerful positions. Women are sort of quite systematically underrepresented. In some areas, even worse than these kind of average figures suggest. Local politics is important for two reasons. Actually, local authorities, um, quite a lot of them have a fairly big budget, and the decisions that they take on housing, on community support, on social care directly affect the residents in these areas. But also, local politics is an important springboard into national level politics, right? So if the kind of pipeline starts leaking, then we are effectively also preventing women from moving up, having the chance of being considered a viable MP candidate in their kind of local party branch, for instance. It's really important to try and pay attention to what's happening with female representation at this level because it could affect the national level and because it's also just important in its own right if we think about the policy implications. So if we think about London, which is where we did this specific study, things are not quite as sort of bad maybe as in other areas. Yeah. So local councils in London have relatively higher rates of women representation, 45% in 2022. But even in London, there are still large gender gaps when we think about seniority and councils having a female leader even in 2025. And importantly, even in London, and this is something that our own research shows as well. I'm going to come on to that in a second. This lack of access to informal networks, the sexism and hostility reported by women politicians in local office is still there. So an important kind of place to sort of test, even if we've got to like a better like baseline level of female representation, what's going on with these women? Are they still saying they don't want to kind of continue where they are? So what I'm going to present now first, before I go into this sort of peer support networks intervention, so I just want to tell you a little bit more about how women in London who are councillors sort of experience local politics. And all of this is based on original survey data that we collected quite painstakingly, actually, in 2024, as part of a joint data collection effort. We were able to get a 30% response rate among elected councillors in London, which is really good for an elite survey. And if you're interested in learning more about the methods or the other findings of that report, you can scan this QR code or follow this link to find out more about that. So the first thing I want to show you is that there is a gender gap in re-election intentions between men and female councillors in this sample of 521 individuals who are actually councillors in London in 2024. So women are less likely than men to say that they want to stand for re-election. And what's really important as well is that women also report that they find council meetings a lot more hostile than their male counterparts. So hostility here is measured on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is like not hostile at all and 10 is really hostile. And we can see that men on average tend towards the not so hostile end of the scale, whereas women are on the sort of opposite side of that distribution, saying that actually council meetings do feel more hostile. And this is compounded if we start looking at ethnic minority women, women from sexual orientation minority groups, for instance. And so I think this is something really interesting to unpack here that also came out quite strongly when we did semi-structured interviews about what sort of being in council actually feels like to women and men politicians. Something else that we asked people is how supported they actually feel in their role. And this was quite shocking to us. So, councillors across the board don't feel very well supported by their party or their peers. A little bit better among civil society, but still not fantastic. Um, and, I think just this sort of bottom statistic there, 42% of counselors say they don't feel any support from their peers. And in the interviews we did with women counselors, this came out really strongly as something that was surprising to these women who sort of joined politics for the first time, in that they perhaps expected to encounter some hostility, maybe even sort of quite toxic comments from potential constituents online or in surgeries, but they thought within council, like their direct peers, even if they're from a different political party, they would have sort of fairly amicable or friendly relationships with. And this was not the case for quite a lot of the people that we spoke to. And I think this is also reflected in these survey statistics here. So something to be said about the sort of lack of informal support, of feeling you can talk to someone in your council who's also an elected politician about some of the challenges that you might be experiencing. And not showing this here, but have this in the appendix if you're interested. Women are especially likely to feel like they don't have these spaces of support among their peers, which then led us to think, okay, what can we do about this together with our civil society partners? They were already running some peer support circles, and we thought this could be a really promising intervention in this space where counselors feel that they don't have access to the sort of supportive spaces that they need to try and navigate public office. So what did we do to try and test if peer support networks affect re-election intentions? We conducted a pre-registered field experiment together with a partner civil society organization. Um, they are Elector, which is a non-partisan civil society organization working to empower more diverse women into politics. And what we did was to randomly assign the full population of actual female elected local councillors in London at the time to a treatment and a control group. The treatment group received an invitation to join a real support network of women local elected councillors in London by the civil society organisation, and the control group did not receive any intervention. What we're really testing with this, and this is quite conservative actually as a test, is letting women councillors know that there is this peer support network out there for them to join, that there is an organization which is not their party, which is non-partisan, which is going to put on this kind of community safe space for them to talk to other people in similar positions who might have been experiencing some of their sort of same challenges in their respective jobs. After we invite people, we then do a completely unrelated survey. So the survey was fielded by us, by the research team, not by our civil society partner organization. Councillors shouldn't have been able to connect these two things at all. And we measure our main outcome measures in this unrelated survey 2 weeks after these invites were sent out. We've got around 120 women in the control condition who actually responded to the survey and 110 in the treatment group, so fairly good coverage among both of our experimental conditions, and no sort of evidence of differential attrition or response rates according to any background characteristics. So among these two groups in our final sample, there is good balance on pre-treatment covariates. So the treatment itself, like I said, was an invitation to join a support network for women locally elected councillors in London, delivered by a non-partisan civil society organization. And this invitation, or this knowledge that this network exists, that you are very warmly invited to it, was delivered through personalized letters and postcards, emails, phone calls, and social media messages. This was quite a heavy communication campaign. So the partner organization really tried to reach counselors on the phone and talk to them about who they are, what they can offer them, how they can help, as well as social media messages. And if you're interested in learning more about sort of what proportion of the sample had these different kind of contact modes, I'm happy to talk about more of that. So the most basic kind of treatment that people received was just postcards, basically, but we tried to reach everyone with all contact modes if we were able to. So everyone was sort of who had a phone number on their website got a call. Some of them we were able to reach, obviously. Some of them we weren't able to reach, went to voicemail. Anyone who had a public-facing social media profile received a message as well. But this is the most basic thing that everyone sort of got delivered into their post box, which is just some information about the organization and this peer support network, as well as another postcard which actually gave some sort of more specific information about this first peer support network session that went on. We then measure our main outcomes 2 weeks after the treatment invitation. What this means is we're really measuring the effect of knowing that this peer support network exists, that it's out there for people to come to join, but not sort of the effect of participating in this network for a really long time, 3, 4 months, for instance, and then the effect of that on re-election intentions. We think that this would be a really great extension. It's something we're trying to sort of hopefully get some money to do at the moment. But we went with this more kind of conservative, slightly simpler design for sort of a first test of if something like this could be effective, partially due to data collection constraints. Both of these efforts were going to go out at a similar time, and this is what we were able to do within those constraints, basically. So in this survey that was unrelated to the treatment invitation, we asked for our 2 main outcome measures, and these are self-reported survey items. So we're asking people, how interested are you in standing for re-election? And how interested are you in running for higher political office? And then we recode these are sort of 1 to 4 answer scales into yes, interested in re-election or higher office, or 0 otherwise. And we also conduct, there's a kind of qualitative angle to this as well, some semi-structured interviews with London councillors, where we talk about why or why not sort of these sort of support mechanisms may matter to their decisions to sort of stay in office, and what some of the challenges around staying in office and their decisions to not stay or to stay are. So what do we find? We find that exposure to support networks increases re-election intentions by 10 percentage points, which is a really large effect. We don't find a significant effect on progressive ambition. Let me show you those results in more detail. So on this graph, you can see the main results for static ambition. So that's interest in standing for re-election at the next opportunity. We can see, first of all, men. Remember that we also sampled male councillors in this overall survey. We can see that 84% of male councillors said they are interested in standing for re-election. And compared to women who were in the control condition, 67%, there's quite a sizable gender gap here, right? Women who didn't get any invitation or information about this peer support are considerably less likely than their male counterparts to say that they're interested in standing for re-election. Now, those women who are in the treatment condition in blue, those are the women who got this invitation from our civil society partner organization that there is this peer support network, that they're very welcome to join, what it's going to be like, and that there is this community out there for them to engage with. If we compare women in the treatment to the control condition, there's a significant difference between the two. If we think about re-election intentions, women who were exposed to this kind of invitation to join this network are significantly more likely to say that they would consider standing for re-election. And so what this shows is that even just sort of like a fairly like low-key intervention to like let women know that some support like this exists, already sort of shapes in like an unrelated survey their willingness to even consider standing for re-election. And we think that this is quite promising in terms of thinking about what the actual effects of participating in a network like this could be on actual re-election intentions. The other outcome that we looked at was progressive ambition. So, with progressive ambition, we mean, would you be interested in considering standing as an MP or running for higher office, like running as mayor, for instance, in the future? And here we don't see any effects of this sort of treatment invitation to join this peer support network. I think it's quite notable that generally, sort of willingness to consider running for a higher office is quite a bit lower than on the other outcome measure. Among men, to 57%, among women around 50. And so it could just be that this fairly like light touch intervention, which was sort of saying to women, we're building up this community to help you cope with the challenges of today, might not have been enough to sort of move that other outcome on progressive ambition. Now, when we look at the sort of what we get out of these sort of semi-structured interviews, especially with women counselors, it becomes clear that informal conversations and sort of support from women outside of their local party is really important to how they perceive being able to cope with some of these challenges. Some of the women who were thinking about leaving local politics sort of directly quoted feeling quite isolated, feeling that they just can't cope with their caring responsibilities or other sort of challenges and being a counselor, and that they're not sure where they would look for support or even knowing what support is kind of available. And so we think that even though networks kind of can't directly address these structural constraints, what they could offer is sort of sharing coping mechanisms, information exchange, and also advocacy spaces where women can come together and then demand change from their local council, for instance. So I think in terms of policy implications, structural kind of constraints are really important. And of course, councils and political parties and leaders, wherever they can, should be implementing family-friendly reforms, for instance. That's something that came out really strongly in our interviews and also in our survey data, as well as tackling harassment, for instance, against women politicians. But alongside all of this, it's also really important to think about how we support women in the meantime who are already there so that they don't drop out, because very often these would be the best advocates for these types of reforms and trying to bring in this lived experience of what it's actually like, why it's so necessary to press ahead with these reforms at the same time. So we don't think of these as mutually exclusive. We think of both of these as really important pathways to improving representativeness of institutions. So, of course, what we'd like to do next is do a much bigger project where we look at the effects of actual participation in these peer support spaces over time. And maybe something else that I would like to leave you with, I think what this work shows quite forcefully is that as organizations, campaigns, parties, civil society, we often think about getting kind of underrepresented groups through the door in the first place. But what this work shows is that it's very challenging for underrepresented groups, including women, to kind of function and be in these institutions once they're there. And a lot of women sort of said to us in the interviews, there was so much support in the training phase, but then once we got there, it just felt like we were abandoned, essentially. And I think that really resonated in why some of these community spaces sort of maybe could like bridge these gaps in terms of providing support once you are actually in office. So shift from just thinking about recruitment to really carefully thinking about retention so that these really important recruitment efforts then actually kind of bear fruit on creating more representative, inclusive institutions. Some other kind of nugget I want to leave you with from our survey data is that, of course, this work focuses on women, and I think that's really important because women are still underrepresented in politics. But our survey measured lots of other socio-demographic background characteristics. And actually, maybe surprisingly, one of the groups that we found was most underrepresented and also most unlikely to think about seeking re-election were actually renters. So, according to housing status, if you parcel people out into owning a home outright, having a mortgage, or renting, it's people who are renting who are very underrepresented in local politics and are also much more likely to say, you know what, actually, I'm not sure if I'm going to stand again. And of course, that's to do with housing precarity and uncertainty. And in a project at the moment, we're looking at what the effects of that underrepresentation are on actual policy preferences. So, what are the effects of this underrepresentation of renters on actual redistributive policies, housing policy at the local level, and some really important work to be done there. So just trying to sort of foreshadow some of the things hopefully we'll be doing with this data on this wider research agenda, which is more projects on kind of what interventions could help to retain women and underrepresented groups, and also thinking about how other characteristics that we often don't measure, like housing status, also lend themselves to really large representation gaps and what that means for democracy and for policy. Cool. That I think that's all from me. Thanks so much for your attention and really happy to share this with you.
So much, Katrina. I'm going to open it up to everyone for questions and answers. You can either leave a question in the chat and I will read them out, or you can unmute yourself and ask directly, and we can answer them in kind. If there's no questions right now to start us off, I do have a few I'll start with one question. I've got lots of questions, but I'll start with one question to start us off. Katrina, I was just wondering if you could please expand on the difference in the value or the impact between peer support groups and other types of support groups, whether that be party support groups, community support groups. Like, if you could just tell us a bit more about why you focus on a peer group specifically and what is unique about that group and why that group is special. And then gosh, I've got lots of other questions, but I do want to let other people ask first as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, it's a great question. I think the reason why peer support is, I think that very often when we think about what is really challenging to women, for instance, being kind of new in these institutions is sort of things that they feel like maybe they can't say out loud to other people around them in their party necessarily without sort of feeling like that could affect their future sort of success chances in the party or things like that, right? Is it okay to struggle with this or not, right? That there might be lots of sort of internal censoring about not wanting to share that things are really difficult for you at at the moment.
So it's sort of like professional feedback. Um, it's a professional element of the group, the professional focus that essentially sort of adds something uniqueness. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And also kind of thinking about how oh sorry, just give me 1 second.
No worries, take your time.
Dry heating, I think. I think it's a lot about that other peers will understand these kind of women's challenges better. So it's kind of not feeling like, you want this authoritative, like sort of hierarchical advice from the top. It's really about finding this kind of community and solidarity with other individuals who might be going through similar challenges as you, who might have just gone through them. So it's this kind of sort of vertical level of support where you feel like you can be quite honest and it's a safe space to share rather than like a very official sort of top-down mechanism that you go to as a last resort. So hopefully what peer support does is it allows earlier sharing of more sort of lower grade things, right, before they build up and become really serious. And it also allows for more kind of honest conversations about how people are actually experiencing their environment at the moment.
Any other questions before from anyone else?
Yes, I do have a quick question if that's okay.
Please.
I really, really enjoyed the presentation. I think this was a really important and meaningful project, and I'm very keen to hear more about the future stages of it. In that sense, in terms of the effects of participating in the peer support network, I was wondering whether there's any way to use the data you currently have of the treatment group and split it um, into women who engaged in any way with the invitation, whether they replied or um, they stated their interest in participating, and women who ignored it. I was just wondering whether there's any sort of difference to be seen even now before any actual sessions with the support network.
Yeah, we do actually. So when we split the data according to sort of the intensity of the contact, which of course isn't randomized, right? It's like what women sort of self-select into, but still it's interesting. We can see that the women who had the most intense contact about the offer, so women who had like an actual back-to-back phone conversation with one of the volunteers, or women who had a back and forth sort of social media written conversation with one of the volunteers, they were the ones who had the strongest treatment effects, which makes sense, right? Because that's where the information was sort of truly delivered in a quite a personal way. They might have asked some follow-up questions. They might have sort of said, "Oh, I've been struggling with this. Do you think that would be covered in these sessions?" Or I don't know, many other people who are also a mom and a counselor. Do you think that would be sort of, and very often just anecdotally from what the volunteers reported back from these phone conversations is that women were so surprised and kind of relieved to know that the space is there, basically. So I think that really speaks to this idea that these networks aren't so common to sort of start with. And then offering that is in itself is like a big, oh wow, okay, there is this sort of source of support out there. And that's also what we see. So when we split down treatment effects into like the most high intensity contact and the low intensity, we see that the effects are strongest among the individuals with the high intensity contact.
That is super interesting. Thank you. Thank you for your reply. I also find it very, very impressive that just the invitation alone has such a big effect. Really, really enjoy that. Really like knowing that it's possible.
Thank you. Yeah. No, it's true. It's like lots of my work is a bit gloomy, so it's nice to feel like, oh, sometimes something has a positive effect. That's good.
Other questions?
Hey,
Yes.
hey Douglas. I have a question. It's kind of more an obs sorry, I'm going to start with an observation and then lead to the question. Um, Peer support networks I've seen used a lot in mental health, and they're used a lot in very extreme cases where you have people that have no other places to go. I've seen them rolled out normally where there's no money. So it's like, it's not our problem. They would get you guys together, let you solve it. I'm wondering, I mean, obviously this is, I really enjoyed the presentation, love all the details and the numbers and the realities of all this. But I'm also curious if you go above like looking at this process, is there, I mean, are there other things, if you had more money or unlimited money, are there more impactful things besides support networks? I feel like support networks are I don't want to come across as being derogatory, but I feel like they're almost like the last gasp. Whereas like maybe there should be built in there should be, if there were funds for what were we talking about implementing family-friendly institutional reforms automatically, then you wouldn't need to have the support network. We wouldn't have to fall back to let you guys figure it out. kind of thing. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out as kind of an observation, kind of a question. I'm not really sure. I'm not that very deep in this area of research, so just throwing that out there.
No, Tristan, I think it's a great point, and I absolutely agree with you. I think, there's a lot that local councils should be doing in terms of making their institutions more inclusive, and that comes out really strongly if you like this QR code that I put in the presentation as well in the report. We talk a lot about the sort of structural reforms that like local institutions need to engage in to become more inclusive and more diverse, and a big part of that is kind of family-friendly policies around childcare provision, but also sort of hybrid access to meetings, thinking about really practical things like what times are all of your council meetings taking place, how many hours, what's the actual burden of being a local elected councillor, what is the pay for that, right? Do you have a harassment officer in place? How do you support local elected politicians who actually experience harassment or abuse from their constituents or from other peers, for instance, right? There's a lot of that should absolutely be going on. And I think our partner organization, Elector, is also really vocal in sort of asking for these structural reforms. Why do I think that sort of peer support networks are still helpful even in that space? Um, I think I think that they're still helpful and important because it often takes time to implement all these reforms. And while they're being implemented as well, there's often a sort of consultation on what should they actually look like. You kind of need like a vocal, at least minority of people to say, we want this reform, we would really benefit from it. Here's what I've heard from other women on why not having it at the moment is really harmful, actually. So I think often these peer support spaces can do two things. They can disseminate information. So let's say Council A has implemented a really helpful childcare reform. Council B hasn't. As a woman in Council B, I now know from my peer that I can ask for these things and maybe rally some support around that. But they're also sort of advocacy mechanisms if they function well, right? There are spaces where people can sort of learn that, yeah, these challenges are really common and they shouldn't be normal, and someone should do something about that. So I think I completely sort of take your point on there are lots of other things that should be happening. But I hope that these support networks can be like one puzzle piece in that rather than a substitution. I think if they're a substitution, that's really problematic and not okay. But I think if they come from civil society actors who are interested in the advocacy effort, not replacing it, I think they can also be powerful spaces for those other changes to happen alongside them.
Cool. Thank you. That was a really thorough answer. That's really helpful. Nice.
We've got time for, I think, one or two more questions. Any other questions?
I
So,
mean, I had another quick one, if that's okay, if nobody else wants to go before me.
go
Um,
ahead, Lena.
I found it very interesting at the end when you were mentioning the underrepresentation of renters in people who want to be re-elected. And I presume this data is for London councillors alone. I was just wondering if you are to research this more deeply, whether there's any way to gather some data outside of London, just because I do think that maybe this lack of wish to be re-elected might have something to do with the possibility of people moving around different councils in different boroughs in London. And I'm not sure if this really carries through to the rest of England, for example. But I don't know much about it, so very happy to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Alina, that like in other areas of England, potentially the proportion of people who are renting and moving around kind of like outside of their local area is lower, definitely. But I would say in other local areas, if we just look at like variables that we can observe, like age, for instance, so if someone is a pensioner or not, that's something that we can often have even in other data sources. Housing status is really uncommon, I think, at the moment. And we see that even in areas outside of London, sort of local councillors tend to be disproportionately older, are much more likely to be pensioners compared to the population in the area in general, right? Over the age of 18. And so, if we think that on average, older people have had more chances to get on the housing ladder, are less likely to be renting than younger people at the moment, then I would expect, at least to some extent, that there is still this gap between sort of renters and individuals who are owning or have a mortgage, even in areas outside of London. Especially in urban areas, right? Thinking about Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, for instance. But also potentially in more kind of rural areas or suburban areas where sort of the distribution of the local council in terms of who they are and what demographics they represent tends to be more skewed to these older age distributions. Um, and some of the very preliminary kind of analysis that we've done on this in London is that not only are renters less represented and also more likely to drop out, they're also a lot less likely to sit on housing committees, for instance, to sit on planning committees. And they tend to have different policy preferences when we think about housing policy than people who are owning a home. And so we think potentially this kind of representation gap can be really important in shaping housing policy decisions at the local level. And so these sort of like almost like pernicious, right, kind of representation cycles, renters are less likely to like go and run for local office because they don't know where they're going to live. Then even if they get in, they might have to stand down because they don't know where they're going to be. And that then affects how well represented sort of renters' preferences are in the policy process. And we think that that's a really important like avenue for more research. So yeah, we're excited to sort of crack on with that and do a bit more research on that at the moment.
Thank you. That was very insightful. Thank you for such a thorough answer.
I think we've got time to squeeze in one more question if anyone wants to ask one. If not, I do want to sort of build off Alina's question and ask, you mentioned during your presentation towards the end, there was kind of like a small bombshell. You talked about other underrepresented groups and not just women. And I know we just talked about renters. What other underrepresented groups were there? And in addition to renters, can you just tell us a bit more about them and why you feel that they would be in the underrepresented category?
Yeah. So we collected really quite rich background data on these counselors, more than we have in like normal surveys. So for instance, we asked about like quite a detailed sort of ethnicity battery, but also their nationality. So if they're sort of moved to the UK at some point, or if they're born there. And we also ask for things like disability status, caring status, sexual orientation. And we find that individuals who have caring responsibilities, so even men who have them, are really disadvantaged by that, right? And that could be like childcare or adult care responsibilities, sort of, I guess, very congruent with some of the research that we did with these women. If they report having caring responsibilities, that really changes how compatible they perceive that job of a local councillor to be with their kind of family life and their other responsibilities. And we find that also really holds for men who have these caring responsibilities. And then the other thing, I think there's a lot of research on this, but individuals who have a disability, very underrepresented and also much more likely to say that they would drop out, basically. And that also holds for ethnicity and some of these intersectional things as well. So among women, for instance, women, kind of Black women, for instance, are one of the groups who sort of report some of the highest rates of sort of abuse and harassment against them, but also sort of the most differential dropout even to other women, for instance. So I think there's definitely more than sort of just gender to kind of look at, which makes sense as well. And interesting to sort of think about that very often we're actually sort of missing out on stuff because it's not visible and we don't ask for these things, right? And so sexual orientation was another one. Individuals who were sort of LGBTQ also said they experienced lots of sort of abuse and discrimination, and were also more likely to say that they would drop out. And again, that's something that we sort of rarely measure in surveys of elected politicians, I would say. So I think the more practical kind of data collection advice, let's say, that's coming out of some of this research is there are some characteristics, background characteristics that we often don't look at, but which might sort of hide some pretty sizable representation gaps, or sort of things that can explain why the experiences of subgroups within women, for instance, are quite different from one another. And there are sort of some subgroups which really experience local politics in a very challenging and really difficult way to sort of other subgroups. And then being able to target the kind of right sort of policy packages, interventions, thinking about what could help is really important. So kind of collecting this data in the first place is something I think that more researchers and potentially policymakers should do so we can track these gaps accurately, and we can also think about who is sort of most excluded or most at risk of being excluded from these places.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop us there, but I do want to launch a survey as soon as I find it. I hope that I got dropped off halfway through this, and I don't know if I have regained all of my admin status rights, and I don't know if I can launch the survey I really want to launch. It looks like I might not be able to do that.
I've just made you the host, maybe.
Oh, just thank you so much. Yeah, no, I should be able. Yeah, you would have been granted the admin. There we go. Polls and quizzes. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to launch a quick impact poll. If everyone could please fill it out, that would be very helpful. In the meantime, thank you so much, Katrina. It was really great hearing your presentation. It was really great, fantastic having you for our 11th and final academic series of the year. And just as a quick reminder to everyone, we have got our first academic series event for next year, 2026, on 29th of January, where James Ackland will be speaking on the neighborhood effects of voter choice. And I hope to see you all there as well. But again, Catherine, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. And in terms of, I'm going to stop the recording here. But in terms